Today, we're going to be talking about calling. Sometimes we confuse calling and we think it's some point out in the horizon or a point down the road. That if we just get a certain title or job or position, that maybe we'll feel fulfilled. Maybe we'll feel satisfied. And I know that sometimes I fall into that trap too. That if I could just gain a certain status or earn a paycheck, that then I'll feel like I finally made it. But I think that that's actually a mirage. I think it's a tactic that Satan uses to lie, kill, steal, and destroy against us, God's people, such that we might not see God's activity in the world around us. Tonight we're going to explore the idea of calling. Is it some point in the future? Or is it something that God is doing within us, that now we can live in the world around us with our calling? My name is Austin Barnett, and I'm currently serving here at the chapel on our community team.
And I'm Korinne. I'm a UB resident physician at UB's residency program. And we've been married now for 2.5 years, so we've been learning a lot about each other. And this is a topic that we just keep coming back to. So I'd like to ask you today, what if you're more than your job title? What if you are more than your job description, your benefits, or your pay? What if your faith and your work didn't have to look separate? What if you were more than your success and more than your failure? What if you could get up every day with an incredible purpose where you would know it was worth it, despite what your job might be or a lack thereof a job?
Ultimately, it's not hard to see that the world around us and the people around us are discontent, unsettled. And maybe this is because we're putting too much emphasis in work. We find ourselves striving for something that never actually fulfills. We must take a step back and realize that this world that we're living in, this culture that we're living in, is unsettled. And it doesn't take much. Researchers have coined the term the Great Resignation. The Great Resignation is back in 2021. And over 47 million Americans quit their job. This was the highest ever until 2022, when over 50 million Americans quit their job. Many citing that they left their job because they wanted to go to a better position or a better job somewhere to make more money. And now new research is saying that over 80% of these people regret that decision. Or a Gallup poll talks about silent quitters. Now, if you're wondering what silent quitters are those who do the bare minimum at their job. They don't try to achieve more or better the industry that they find themselves in. They have a job job, but they don't operate in their calling. They just operate at status quo. And this Gallup poll says that 50% of all of the workforce are silent quitters. Additionally, you could look in the U.S. benefits trend study, and it shows that job satisfaction is at a 20-year low, with 70% of people intending to be with their company in 12 months, which means the next time you go to work, if you look around the room, 3 out of every 10 people you see don't intend to be with your company within the next 12 months.
Now, maybe you're asking yourself, why all this talk about work? Isn't this supposed to be a talk on calling? Well, for one, the average person will spend 90,000 hours of their lifetime at work. And secondly, we believe that for the majority of people, their identity is completely wrapped up in their work. That's why whenever you meet someone new, the conversation usually goes like this. Hi, I'm Korinne. What's your name?
Austin, pleasure to meet you.
Nice to meet you. What do you do for a living? What do you do? Work is often conflated with identity, but work in and of itself is not wrong. We see that in the creation narrative in Genesis 2, when God says, "Let me take Adam and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it." And let us not forget, this was before the fall. Your job might feel like it's part of the fall, but in reality, your work in general is not.
It's easy to think that our job is a result of the fall. But often it's because of the anxiety that's wrapped up in that question. And we ask ourselves questions all of the time, don't we? So maybe you're in high school and you're asking the question around, should I go to college? Or should I not go to college? And if I go to college, should I choose a major based upon its one-day potential earnings? But we all know the questions don't end there. Once we are in college, we begin asking different questions. Questions like, when I get out of college, where will I get a job? Should I just take the job that gives me most money? Or should I take the job that would give me the most satisfaction? And then we're in the workforce and we're still asking questions. We're asking questions like if I get a promotion, should I take it, even though I know that it might not fit my gift set? Or if I get called from a different company to join them, should I just take it because it's going to give me more money, even if it means ripping myself of my relationships or my family relationships and moving across country? These are all questions that we begin to ask ourselves. Maybe for you, there's shame when we talk about work because you don't have a job right now. Maybe your company had to downsize and they had to lay you off. Or you've just had a hard time getting back into the job market. Or you're retired and you feel like you're not contributing to the world like you once have. Maybe for you, you're a single parent or a stay-at-home mom or stay-at-home dad. You feel maybe misunderstood. Misunderstood as if raising a child was somehow less of a contribution to this world than a job that gives you a W-2. We get caught up in the anxiety of future work and we ask so many questions, and I wonder if maybe we're pursuing the right things, but for all of the wrong reasons. Maybe it's because we're pursuing a career and not a calling.
And this isn't anything new, so we really shouldn't be surprised. People have been experiencing these dilemmas for all of time. If we take Israel, for example, wandering in the desert on the way to the Promised Land, a journey that could have taken them 11 days took 40 years. Do you think they ever wondered if they were doing the right things? Do you think they ever doubted what their purpose might be? Of course they did. We see that in Numbers 14 when they say to each other, let us choose a leader and go back to Egypt. Let's go back to what's comfortable, to what's known, to what's expected. But let us not forget God's purpose. God's purpose is to have a set-apart nation, Israel, so that when the world looks at how Israel lives, that the world might see God. So set apart, so distinct, so different, the way they use their money in generosity, the way that they're sacrificial towards people that could never be sacrificial towards them, the way that they loved their neighbor as themselves, that when the world saw that they would see the one true living King. Now, would you believe me today if I told you that your calling has more to do with this than with any job title or lack thereof one?
Maybe it's time for us to begin asking different questions. Questions like, God, what do you want to restore in me today? Or, God, what do you want to restore in the world around me today? Do you know that God's in the restorative business? He wants to restore the world back to himself through his son, Jesus. And now we can enter into this process, this restoration work, because we are ambassadors and co-heirs with Christ. This is the calling of every believer, that we would partake in the restoration process of broken people and broken systems through our work and our words through Jesus Christ. This is what we can enter into as believers, to restore the world back to God through his son, Jesus. Now, here's the good news. You don't have to change your job situation to join God in this work. We can join him as we do this. Or as Dorothy Sayers says, an author in the early 1900s, she says it this way: Christian work is good work well done.
Or as Martin Luther King Jr. has said, if it falls your lot to be a street sweeper, sweep streets like Michelangelo painted pictures. Sweep streets like Beethoven composed music. Sweep streets like Shakespeare wrote poetry. Sweep streets so well that all the hosts of heaven and earth would have to pause and say, here lived a great street sweeper who swept his lot well. What if we believed that our calling was to the everyday, ordinary things, rather than just to a someday calling that might not ever come, and even if it did come, could never truly fulfill us? I know for me, as a resident physician, I work, 80 hours or so a week, but I know that my everyday calling is to serve the vulnerable, the forgotten, and the poor, to be used as a vessel of Christ that he might restore love and hope and dignity back to the image bearers of God. Some might think that I went into medicine for the paycheck, or for a certain status, or for people to look at me a specific way when I walk into the room. But I know that my calling goes way deeper than that and is way bigger than that. I resonate with the Apostle Paul in the book of Philippians when he says, what is more, I consider all things a loss for the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus, my Lord, for whose sake I have lost all things. For I consider them garbage, that I may gain Christ and be found in him, not having a righteousness of my own that comes from the law, but that which is through faith in Christ. My everyday calling started when I was in the 8th grade. on a class field trip to downtown Rochester, we literally washed the feet of the poor. It was in those moments that I realized I didn't want to someday wait for my calling to serve those in need, but I began viewing my calling as an everyday calling to serve the vulnerable, the forgotten, and the poor. And maybe you're thinking to yourself, well, that sounds like a lot of pretty words, but what does that actually look like? Well, for me, it looks like sitting at the bed of a woman who is a widow, who's a mom, who's sick, whose kids are far from her when she's scared and sick in the hospital. It looks like being in the emergency room with a woman who's actively withdrawing from alcohol and getting to pray with her and getting to remind her that God has purpose and loves her, even when she doesn't feel loved by him, when she feels like she's too far gone. It looks like being in the ICU with someone whose heart stopped, who shouldn't have made it, but did, and looking at them and telling them that they are a living miracle and that they have purpose left on this world. And then getting them to reflect and them coming up with their own idea that maybe I should be nicer to my son. Or it looks like being with kids, 5-year-olds, getting on the ground with them and getting into their mind and understanding what's important to them. So it puts both them and their parents at ease while we try to figure out what's making them sick. I know for me, my everyday calling is not to status, it's to service. I know my everyday calling is not to just hold the title of doctor, but it's to be a faithful daughter to the King.
And for me, my everyday calling is to equip and invest and inspire others to live a holy, disciplined life. You know, I work at a church, so some people think that I just work on Sundays or that I just put events on or create opportunities for people to serve their church in their city. But my calling is much bigger and deeper than that. My calling story goes back to the 8th grade as well. And I came from a more ritualistic church background, and I felt like I had to conform to this mold. And it wasn't until my youth pastor in the 8th grade showed me what true faith is, that I didn't need to conform to a certain mold or make sure I followed a certain set of rituals, but instead I needed to enter into a relationship with the God of the universe. And this changed everything for me. I began to see faith in a new way, and it became alive. It was less religion and more relationship. And I knew from that day on that that would be my endeavor in life as well, that my everyday calling would be to allow other people to see that this relationship with Jesus can change everything. So for me, what that looks like is spending multiple days a week with young men and being able to invest and equip and inspire them to live on mission for what God has in their life. It looks like getting up at 6 a.m. in the morning to meet a group of guys at Panera. And we have a Bible study on Wednesday mornings. This is all what it looks like to daily follow Jesus as I look to equip and inspire and develop others towards a holy, disciplined life. This is my everyday calling. So the question tonight for you is, what's your everyday calling? What is your everyday calling? And what does that look like? Ultimately, your everyday calling is not to stockpile wealth. Your everyday calling is to live generously out of the abundance of a generous God, King Jesus. Your everyday calling is not to productivity, but to the presence of Christ. Your everyday calling is not to the hustle of this world, but to the rhythms of grace that Jesus gives to each and every one of his believers. Your everyday calling is not to pursue that next job or paycheck. Your everyday calling is to pursue and chase after Jesus. Your everyday calling is not to earn a degree. Rather, your everyday calling is to understand the spiritual giftedness that the Spirit has given you and contribute to the world around you for the glory of God and the good of others with it. And parents, your everyday calling is not to raise a successful child. Your everyday calling is to raise a disciple of Jesus.
Your everyday calling is not to a big house in a quiet cul-de-sac. Your everyday calling is to be the salt and light of Christ to the neighbors that God has specifically placed in your midst. Your everyday calling is to not create this image like you have it all together. Your everyday calling is to be honest and authentic to God's work in your life. Your everyday calling is not to proclaim one thing on Sunday morning and then to live completely differently on Monday morning or on Friday night. Your everyday calling is to let the Spirit of God infiltrate every aspect of your life and to be obedient to his calling and to his leading. Your everyday calling is not to success. Your everyday calling is to service and to allow the Spirit of God to infuse the world around you with love, hope, and faith and dignity that only He can provide. Your everyday calling is not to live like the world, or to talk like the world, or to act like the world, or to think like the world. Your everyday calling is to live for another world, so that when this world looks on you, that they may see there's something out of this world, that they may see the one true God. Your everyday calling is not about where you are going. Your everyday calling is about who you are becoming. If I can say it any more simply, your everyday calling is not to a destination. Your everyday calling is to a person, because your everyday calling is an everyday, not a someday.
Hey church family, thank you for taking the time to watch this video. This content was presented at the chapel's annual Equip event. Those who attended the event had the opportunity to submit questions. The following video is the question and answer portion of that event.
Thank you, Austin and Corey. Appreciate what you shared tonight, and also not just what you shared, but how you shared it. This is obviously resonating with a lot of people, and I guess maybe a first question would be, how do you balance calling and paycheck? All right. So what if someone feels like, if I really leaned into what I think is my calling, I would be struggling financially. So I feel like I have to sacrifice one in order to have the other. What would you say to someone who's feeling and thinking that way?
I can speak to that, my own.
Yeah.
First of all, studies have shown that after a certain level of income, your happiness doesn't increase, for number one. And secondly, the Bible's clear. We can only serve one God. We can't serve both money and God. And so we have to make that choice clear, and we have to make that choice definitive. And sometimes that means a definitive choice every day. I know for myself, I absolutely struggle with my flesh, where one day I will make more than I'm making right now, but I'm not living for that paycheck. I don't want that money for myself. Austin and I often talk about this, that how much money of God's money am I going to keep for myself? Mm-hmm. If everything is truly His, and if we're His, and if the talents, the gifts, the resources that He's given to us are His, then how much are we going to choose to keep for ourselves? And I think that's helpful to when we're thinking about career, money, the costs, all that goes with it.
I think there's definitely things to be said, right? There's surely situations where that becomes clear and something that needs to be dealt with. But I also think in having some conversations with others, often we put ourselves in situations, we want to talk about the stewardship side of things, right? Mm-hmm. We put ourselves in situations where we feel like we need a certain amount of money in order to achieve the lifestyle or the standard of living that we want to live in. That's why I feel like community is so important in life, right? And you're one of those friends in my life that if there's a big financial decision or something's going on, like I'll run it by you and say, does this make sense? Is this in alignment with what it means to be a Christ follower? So I think, if you're in a spot where it becomes tricky, right? If you've taken on a lease for a new car, you've bought a house that maybe you couldn't quite afford, and you have these bills that you've now acquired, and you're pursuing a career to get money to pay those bills, well, really, you're not pursuing a calling at that point. You're pursuing the paycheck to pay your standard of living.
And you guys even touched on that by saying that what God is actually inviting us into doesn't require us to change our job situation. So there's even maybe some incomplete or broken ways that we think sometimes that I can either serve God over here, and that's Austin's job, right? Because you work here at the chapel. Sure. I can either serve God or I can pursue a career. And I think what you helped us understand and what you are saying to us is that's a false dichotomy, right? That it's not either I do this or I go pursue becoming a medical professional. You're saying the calling can show up. Let's take it down to the most granular basic thing. I can embrace my calling if I worked at McDonald's, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and what does that look like then?
I think what I've learned even in preparing for tonight is if this is true, like in what we talk about with calling, then actually I can fulfill the calling that God has me on, and I don't have to work at a church.
Yeah.
which is weird to me because I've always, that's just been where my vocation has landed for the majority of my life. But truly, if I believe this is my calling, I don't have to work at a church to do these things.
Right.
And it's not perfect. Like, Korinne and I still have conversations about this often. But what does it look like for our calling even in our neighborhood, right? We have Muslim neighbors that live across the street from us. And we've had conversations with them, and their grandson is coming into town in a few weeks and has some health problems. Okay, great. Corey's able to step in and to be that ability to be a medical professional in their life, right? And we left the conversation like, would you be praying for our grandson and doing different things? So it's okay, how do our callings exist, not just in the physical location that we go to work, but how do our callings exist in the day-to-day life that we live?
That's great. There's a question here that's more for Dr. Barnett, and that's how it's written. So,
Who did that?
I'll sit this out.
Yeah, I'll call you Corey. How do you bring the gospel to your work, and how is that not like something you get in trouble for? I mean, that could maybe be a problem, and maybe people are thinking, if I did that, if I said you have a purpose and God has a purpose for your life, if I said that at my job, maybe someone's thinking I would be in the HR office like within a few hours. So what does your faith impacting your work look like? I'm specifically looking at you for that question.
I think that's a great question, and I think it can feel tricky, and sometimes trickier than it maybe is. Of course, I'm not standing on rounds with a big sign that says, I love Jesus. I'm not, going into every patient's room and being like, I'm thinking about you, I'm praying for you, just letting you know. I'm building relationships, and that's what this is all about. It's with your coworkers. It's getting to exactly what we were talking about earlier tonight, is learning their story and not being weird about it, but just saying like, hey, tell me about you. Where are you from? Like, what are the big moments of your life? What things do you struggle with? And just starting to get a glimpse into someone else's understanding of the world and being more of a listener than a talker, I think goes a long way. In addition to that, I think if for people who are in healthcare, there's this aspect of holistic medicine, mind, body, soul, spirit. And a mentor of mine encourages me with this, that, if you are ever to be confronted, it's, hey, this is proven. This is data that drives this, that says that this is good for outcomes, this is good for health, to address the holistic aspect of medicine, not just talking about the medicine or the actual drugs or your comorbidities or what you do for a living, but there's a spiritual side to our world. And patients really appreciate when you actually talk about it and ask them, hey, do you go to church? Like, do you have a faith? Tell me about that. I'd love to learn about you. But I think it always comes back to relationship and entering into that with humility and a humbleness to learn about the other person and not just force, your viewpoint or your thoughts or our viewpoint and thoughts on other people.
Yeah. And Austin quoted Dorothy Sayers that Christian work, good work done well. And when you show up every day and you're not mailing it in, it's not a race to the bottom. What's the bare minimum that I have to do today to really clock in, clock out, and go home? But it's actually, God has me here. Absolutely. Wherever here is, God has me here for a purpose. And it's not just my paycheck.
Amen.
Right? You guys talked about that. What would you say to someone who's maybe not feeling content? Maybe they're wrestling with the discussion about, and there's a few questions about, how do I know when it's time to change a job? How do I know if I should leave this and take that, and you touched on that a little bit, but what would you say to someone who's battling maybe a discontent, and how do you speak to that person to feel like, hey, you have a calling, and yes, maybe a change is necessary, but even if not, what would you say to someone like that?
Yeah, I mean, there's times when you need to leave, right? There are moments like that for sure. But someone once said to me, when I was wrestling with this very similar question, are you running to something or running from something? And that struck me, right? Are we running to something? Is this something that God is calling me to and opening up a door of opportunity? Or am I choosing to not let the Spirit work something out in my life where I am now? And ultimately, the Spirit's probably going to work on me at the next place. So if I run my 2-3 year track here, and here's my bag of tricks, and here's what I can do, and then the Lord's
it gets
trying,
hard.
Right? It gets hard, and the Spirit's trying to conform, work in my life and root some things out. And then I just hit the eject button because I don't want to deal with it. Then I move to the next place. And then I do the same thing there. And then after 3 years, I get discontent because the Spirit's trying to do the same thing, as opposed to asking the question, God, is there something that you're trying to teach me here that you're graciously uprooting from my life? But yeah, of course, there's times when, with prayer and good community and to be able to process some of that stuff out, that it is the appropriate time to move.
Yeah, but it's like James 1, right? Like letting perseverance finish its work.
Sure.
And a lot of times we probably short circuit the work of the Spirit and don't let that perseverance complete its work. And instead, as soon as it gets difficult, we jump out, right? And we pull the ripcord. When maybe what God has intended for us is, I'm actually trying to form you here, and the way that you handle that formation is actually going to lead to further gospel opportunities, which you want, right? There's also some questions about how marriage plays into this. So specifically, how can you help one another? And you're 2.5 years into marriage, so obviously you're experts.
Experts.
Yeah, right.
Oh my gosh,
Yeah.
so much to learn.
Yeah, right. But sometimes it's helpful to hear a more fresh perspective because you guys are coming at this with fresh eyes, right? So how have you tried to help one another lean into calling for each other? And it's different. It's not, hey, we're both on staff at the chapel, or we're both medical professionals, or we're both lawyers, or we're both teachers, whatever. But like, how do you help one another lean into that fully? What does that look like so far?
Yeah, I've learned a lot about communication.
Okay.
Do you ever master that? Do you get?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Sure.
you get there. Okay.
For sure.
Okay. I've had to learn knowing your partner in marriage and knowing when and how to support them, right? So there's moments where Corey will just look at me and say, can you just sit in this with me for a minute? Because I'm just like, well, you could do this or this. So here's a better perspective.
You go right to problem solving?
No, I know, isn't that it?
Rookie mistake.
Yeah. This isn't a counseling session.
Sorry, yeah.
I thought this was a question.
Yeah, sorry. I'm still bitter that you didn't ask me to do your premarital, so that's only kidding.
No, I think if it, as simple as possible, there's moments when I need to sit and listen and be with her and process it through. And then there's other moments where I need to remind her, I need to be reminded in other, if the roles were reversed, and remind her that this is her calling, right? For us, practically, there's many weeks that Corey's working over 80 hours a week in the hospital. And we get minimal time together at the house or dinners together, anything. Social life, we can't do a lot of things together, so that's very difficult for us. But reminding her that it's not, hey, endure this for the next 2.5 years so that you can one day get a paycheck. That's bigger than what you're getting now. That's not the end goal. The goal is, and we've talked about this since we were dating, for Corey to be able to care for those that are forgotten, vulnerable, who are overlooked. And this allows her to do that in a very, very unique way, both now and in the future. And for her to be able to continue to keep that perspective is helpful. And there's moments where I can remind her of that, and there's moments where I just need to sit and say, this is just not fun.
Yeah.
That's great. I think if I could add anything, it's such a good response. A mentor of mine who's super wise told me that in marriage, you don't want to be like this. You want to be like this. And that comes along with gifting, with submitting to each other equally. And that has just been so helpful. And Austin does that absolutely. He encourages me. He has learned so incredibly to sit with me in some of the difficult things of presidency. But he also has different gifts than I do. So he can point out areas that I have blind spots in, and same with me for him. So much of my job as his wife is to encourage him. And that's one of my gifts, where I can come alongside him and I can encourage him in what God has called him to at our church, to lead, to equip, to call people to the mission of God. And that's a huge honor to me. I consider that one of the biggest honors of my life. So sometimes I think it can be perspective and trying to step into your shoes, because you work in a church with believers all around you, and I work with almost no believers. But remembering that our work is sacred, all of it is sacred, despite whether you're working in a church or in a hospital or in a school, all of it is ministry. And so us getting to come alongside of each other and remind each other that, I think is super beneficial and helps us to really grow.
One thing I'll add too is, this isn't a counseling session, but something I have learned from you, is the idea in marriage, the goal and purpose of marriage is so that we can continue to allow each other to become more like Christ in our pursuit, in our marriage with each other, so that one day when we stand before the Lord, we can present our bride, or I can present my bride and she can present me in front of Christ, more like Christ, looking more like Christ as a result of the ways that we've helped the refinement, the sanctification, the becoming more like Christ throughout the course of our life. So I think an easy thing maybe to ask ourselves too is, am I willing to let my spouse speak into my Christ-likeness? If that's their purpose, to help me become more like Christ, am I willing to hear the hard things from Corey? Not just the encouragement, because she's amazing at that, but the difficult things of, hey, maybe you didn't respond well in this moment, or maybe you should have done this differently. Okay, if it's for the purpose of making me more like Christ, I need to be willing to receive that, where oftentimes it's in our world or culture, it's easy to just stiff arm.
Yeah, cut out the haters, right? And no negative talk around us. And if someone says anything negative at all,
Messing with my vibes.
yeah, you're killing my vibes, man.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, if you can't trust the instrument of God, known as your spouse, who actually wants what's best for you, not just wanting to win an argument, right? If they actually want what's best for you. If you can't trust God's instrument there, who are you going to trust? Who are you going to let in, really, if you're not going to let him use your spouse to do that? So thank you for that encouragement. Any parting thoughts on calling and discovery of that, or anything you want to leave our church with tonight? Either of you, both of you.
Yeah, I can go first. I think with anything, Jay touched on it, Pastor Leroy touched on it. All of these things, and we talked about it in the beginning, right? There's no destination here other than when we become face-to-face with Christ. So for all of these things, whether it's being able to and more comfortable sharing the gospel, or whether it's looking at your physical fitness and the things that you're eating and doing all those things, or it's your calling and discovering those things, I think we often get frustrated and we stunt our growth because we're not where we want to be yet, without celebrating how far we've come and without celebrating what God's currently doing in our life. So just be okay with the middle ground of the constant churning and discovering and learning about Christ. And I think that comes primarily through spending time with him, like protecting that time to be alone and hearing his voice, and let the Spirit do the work in you. Let the Spirit continue to refine and process you in that. So if any encouragement, enjoy the journey and the process, because we're sure not there yet.
Yeah, that's great.
Absolutely. Yes, I think something too that I hope can encourage us is it's never too late to start, whether you're in college and you want to change a major, or you're in the middle of your career and you just feel like it's not what you thought it would be, or if you're retired and you're looking back on your career thinking, I did everything and I still don't feel fulfilled, or, I tried my best and it still wasn't what I hoped it was. I want to encourage you that it's never too late to start living for God's calling on your life right now. And that means getting in the Word, knowing Jesus, spending time with him, asking him to teach you whatever it is he's trying to tell you. And then 2 helpful questions that we somewhat touched on. God, what do you want to restore in me today? And Lord, what do you want to restore in the people or the environment around me today? I think it's 2 helpful points to see God in motion, and that God is alive and active, and he will show up and he will respond. And you will feel that, man, I think I am living out what God's calling me to live out right now.
Thank you. That's awesome. That's a good word. How about a hand for Austin and Corey Barnett? Thank you, friends. Appreciate you guys.